You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And our topic today is talking about when you have evidence but you don't have buy-in. And by that, I mean when you're trying to argue someone who is holding an opinion without fact when you have facts.
And for me, the way I like to frame this topic is, when is it okay to agree to disagree with somebody? And I know oftentimes when I'm having a conversation with my wife and we're talking about this, she's a scientist as well, it gets frustrating when the person you're discussing things with doesn't have all the facts. And then at the end, they simply say, well, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And it's, what do you do? What do you do? As a scientist, how do you engage with somebody who readily admits, well, I don't have all the facts, but I believe what I believe, and you're just going to have to deal with that?
A good life motto is to say you have strong opinions held very loosely. So you're always willing to change when you learn new facts.
And that's actually a really good way to describe what science is supposed to be, that you're open to changing your opinion based on new information.
Yeah, you have to, because as we get new evidence and we learn new things, then what we thought was true gets modified a little bit.
Have you ever been worried about the hypothesis theory where, when you're in grade school, they say develop a hypothesis and then go collect data to see whether your hypothesis is true or not? And when you're impassionate and separated, that's fine. But when you truly wish to believe that your hypothesis is true, you can go astray.
You can have confirmation bias.
Could you explain what that is?
It's where you have a bias where you only see the facts or information that confirm what you are trying to prove or your opinion.
That actually happens not just in science, but in social sciences and
social media.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, so this is the topic that we felt was important to discuss.
And to your point of forming a hypothesis and then doing an experiment, that's the traditional scientific method. But I think I've always approached experiments saying, why is this happening? Then I do a test that could make sense, but the question is why not? Is it this specific thing? Sure, that might drive your experimental protocol and design, but I'm always open to it not being the thing. And half the time it's not the thing. 90% of the time it's not the thing.
So a key to being a good scientist is to always have an open mind and be willing to consider new evidence.
Correct.
Awesome. So in regards to having evidence but not buy-in, do you have any examples that you could share with the listeners today?
Well, we could go way back to one of the most foundational, a lot of evidence and not a lot of buy-in from society, which is the debate that still occurs over evolution. Which shockingly still occurs.
When did Darwin? Do you remember when Darwin had his theory of species?
He published in 1859.
So it's about 170 years.
Oh my gosh, I feel so old. Not that I was alive then.
Okay, so as the biologist of the team, could you give a synopsis of what Darwin said?
Darwin didn't actually ever use the word evolution. He said descent with modification. So he had four main observations, essentially that you have to have variation in a population that is heritable. So meaning it can't be something that you acquire after birth that isn't in your genome, even though he didn't have those words. You have to have an environment that can't support all offspring, so there is competition. You have to have variability in how those genetic traits express, where one gives an advantage or not. And essentially, those who have an advantage have to reproduce more. And so it's seen over the course of generations.
So the last point about the reproduction, if there's an advantage, then it will manifest in a favorable reproduction rate.
Correct. So everything to do with evolution and fitness has nothing to do with you as an individual. It's just how many babies you can have.
Who survive.
Yeah. I like to make the joke.
Reproduction age.
Yeah. I like to make the joke that I'm evolutionarily very unfit by only having one child.
Well, I guess I'm laughing. I'm sorry. But strictly speaking, I think you're correct.
I am correct. Yeah. And before I had the one child, I was like an evolutionary dud.
Well, but at least you have the one now.
Yeah. I mean, that's my contribution to the human population moving forward.
So I have a quick question. I remember when I was in grade school, or maybe it was middle school, and we were talking about these ideas, and the example that the teacher used was to take a mouse and then cut off the tail. I know it sounds horrible and mean, and then see whether or not the offspring of that mouse had tails or not. And the notion is that you can't create a modification through physical mechanisms. It has to be stored somewhere else.
Yeah,
and that's the DNA.
Exactly. I always use the example of if I go to the gym and get super buff, it doesn't mean I'm going to give birth to a buff baby. Because that's not a genetic thing. That's a choice I've made of what I'm doing.
I never thought of it that way. That's not an idea that I had previously thought of. That's interesting.
But the idea of use and disuse resulting in evolution was Lamarckian. So he originally came up with the idea of evolution before Darwin, but it wasn't based on evidence. It was just if a trait's used a lot, it'll accumulate and get bigger and stronger. And if you don't use it, then it'll get weeded out, which kind of makes some logical sense, but it also would be like if I tied my left arm behind my back, then I'd have kids without left arms, or mouse babies without tails. They're actually called pups, mouse pups.
Awesome. So can you share a little bit more about how the genetic information is transferred from generation to generation? If it's not, through that physical trait, use it or lose it kind of a thing, how does the information transfer from parent to child?
You get half your DNA from your mom and half from your dad, and it's whichever traits you happen to get from that gamete from them. And if they're positive, if they're negative, it's just how they manifest in you. So your DNA isn't going to change by your physical actions, and I'm talking at the sequence level, because there are changes that can happen to your DNA and epigenetics, so above the sequence level from lifestyle. But you have to have something that's heritable in a genetic change that results in a phenotype or an expression of that trait.
So what's a mutation?
There's lots of different mutations, but it's typically a change in a gene that results in, for the purposes of evolution, it has to change how the product of that gene functions. So you can't select for something that doesn't confer a benefit or a detriment. You can't select for or against. So there has to be a physical change that is either good or bad. And it's all environmentally dependent.
So what might cause a mutation in a genome? How does that actually, what is the physical cause of it?
They're completely random. So you could get it from exposure to radiation. You could get it from a copying error when you're copying your DNA, but it's never goal directed. It's just, it happens and it does something or it doesn't. It's good or it's bad.
So how do we test that? How do we prove that in fact is how it works?
They've done a lot of studies on it. So first of all, is there something that you would like to be able to do that you can't do?
I'd like to fly.
Yeah. So do you think you can just will your genome to make sequences to produce wings?
I hadn't thought about it. I don't think so.
You cannot. To be clear, that's not an option. And there's been a lot of research that mostly with like bacterial species, because you have to have tons of generations to do this, but the chances of a beneficial mutation coming about is completely random. So I gave this example in class. If you have bacteria that can't digest a certain sugar, so let's just say fructose, and you put those bacteria on a plate with fructose and a plate without fructose, there is 100% even chance that the mutation to be able to do that would arise in either plate first. Just because something would be good to do doesn't mean that the genome can have a goal to get there. It's just if that trait happens to arise and that resource is available, then it can become more common because it's conferring a benefit.
Can the environment also influence the direction of evolution? Because I'm thinking about COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And we heard about all the new strains, this strain, that strain. It's popping up in South Africa or popping up in Europe or popping up somewhere else on the planet. And I'm curious if there are, because what will happen is COVID will evolve to start to evade the vaccines that we've developed. So it almost seems like it has a mind of its own.
It doesn't have that objective. It just mutates constantly, and a bunch of the mutations don't work, and they're not able to continue to propagate the virus, and you never see those. It's just the mutations that randomly arise and make it resistant to something. That's what accumulates in the population because it totally randomly just happened. So if you think about those mutation rates, or maybe there's 1,000 mutants and only 2 of them make it.
And so I guess that's the other part that's really kind of curious for me, not a biologist, is that you have millions and millions of mutations happening all simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe only one will at some point provide a benefit.
Correct.
And because that one mutation does, the offspring that has that one mutation all of a sudden grow in dominance.
Correct.
So with that COVID-19 strains, there is a particular mutation that creates in potentially one virus, this ability, which then propagates to the point where it becomes dominant over all the other strains.
Yeah, exactly. So it randomly has a mutation that gave it a benefit, and therefore it becomes most common.
And so, it's easy to see in the COVID-19 pandemic because the reproduction rate is so astronomically high.
Right, and that's why they were worried about people getting vaccinated, because anytime a person gets COVID-19, you're giving it an opportunity to mutate. So it's not that it's going to intentionally get better. You're just giving more and more replicates where a random mutation could arise. So you want to cut it off at the knees.
So there seems to be a lot of evidence to support, the theory of evolution through this, mechanism that you've been describing.
Yes.
Yet there still is a lot of hesitancy from various sections of society. And, I've heard about intelligent design because what people will say, and I've heard people say this, that, oh, Chris, your eye is so complicated. There's no way that could have developed as a mutation.
Right. So I think people who tend to believe in intelligent design think that there is a perfect organism or a perfect role of something, and then you achieve it, right? But evolution's ongoing and always happening, and every trait we have is a compromise. So that we don't have like central vision in our eyes where like our retina, our optic nerve meets our retina, our brain fills it in. Other species have a different way of connecting their optic nerve where they don't have that. So do we have the best eye? We have kind of a garbage eye, but it works. And there's so many things that okay, we're bipedal, but that causes us to have back pain. And then we have to have offspring so young that are so dependent, they can't walk for a year because they wouldn't fit out of a pelvis otherwise. So it's all compromises. I feel like people who say intelligent design where there's a deity directing it, well, that deity clearly doesn't know what they're doing. They're making a ton of mistakes. And that is the goal, because everything you have is just it worked best, and that was the only option at the time.
Do you have examples of legacy, biological pieces that don't really have a strong function?
Like vestigial structures?
Sure.
Like how whales still have bones for legs in their bellies?
What?
Yeah, they do.
They have legs in their bellies?
I mean, they have bones that would have been part of legs in their bellies.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
Because they still have the genes to make leg bones, and they haven't mutated away and stopped.
How about an appendix in a human?
Appendix has immune function.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Just like tonsils and adenoids, where they thought for a long time, just meh. They're there doing something. They're just also susceptible to infection.
That's cool. I thought the appendix was completely superfluous and had no function. But what do I know? I'm just a physicist.
Well, I think people thought that for a while, and then they realized the reason it gets infected and stuff is that it does have some roles doing those things. But I'm going to be very clear. I'm a molecular biologist, not a physiologist. So
we need to get Bill Churro. All right. So final question. Do you believe that the human species is continuing to evolve?
We are, but we're interfering with it significantly.
Please explain that last comment.
Modern medicine.
Oh.
So if you were to allow evolution and natural selection to occur, you would allow for survival of the fittest, and therefore those who are not fit would not reproduce and survive. But with modern medicine interventions to keep us alive, to keep us healthy with reproductive technologies, we're removing the barriers or rather the way that evolution could work on us in preventing that from happening. But we're still undergoing it, for sure. It's just not as rapid as it would have been if we weren't trying to help each other, which I'm fine with that. Like, I'm all for modern medicine. I'm not encouraging people to not take medicine.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for listening today.
Yeah, and hopefully you tune in next time. You've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
See you next time.